In last week's parashah, we saw how the adult population of the first generation of Israel died out while wandering in the wilderness. Yahweh had decreed that all who were 20 years and older would never enter the land of Canaan. After the 38 years of wandering, it was the second generation of Israel who advanced forward towards the eastern side of the Yarden River, that's the Jordan. Yahweh instructed that they camp on the plains of Moab at the foot of the Pisgah range, near the northern end of the Dead Sea. However, before they could actually leave the plains of Moab and enter the territory, before they could take the land of Canaan, we must step back and look at the promise that was made in Genesis chapter 15, where Yahweh made a covenant with Avram, promising that his descendants would inherit the land all the way from the Yadi of Egypt to the river Euphrates. That is, all the land, both east and west of the Yarden River. But the land to the east of the Yarden was to be possessed by Ishmael and Esau, while the land to the west, the land of Canaan, was promised to the descendants of Yitzhak and Yaakov. However, in verse 16 of chapter 15 of Genesis, Yahweh said to Avram, "Only in the fourth generation will your descendants come back here, because only then will the Amori be ripe for punishment." The Amori and the Canaani were two people groups that were mentioned in that covenant to Avram. All 10 tribes that were mentioned were to be removed from the land that was promised to Israel, only when they were there ready to take possession of it. Many Gentile people have asked, why did Yahweh remove those 10 tribes from the land of Canaan? Why should 10 people groups who had been living in that territory since the dispersion from the Tower of Babel be dispersed in favor of the chosen people of Yahweh? The answer is far deeper than just a territorial dispute because of the promise he'd made to Abraham. The underlying reason, which was and still is applicable, is because it is the center of the mass of land of the earth. That is why Yahweh wanted that territory. Aware of the importance of God's chosen territory, the adversary, of course, having failed to control the people groups at the Tower of Babel, planted 10 of the most despicable nations in the land of Canaan as a barrier to prevent Israel from taking up their rightful inheritance. Now, this is very similar to what happened much later in Jerusalem when the Ottoman Empire placed graves in front of the Golden Gate so as to prevent the Messiah of Israel from returning and entering through that gate. But no plan of the adversary will ever thwart the sovereign plan of God. As we saw 2 weeks ago, the 10 spies, returned with bad reports because they had encountered the Anakim, who were considered to be giants. Now, the Anakim had also been planted in the midst of the Amori in the land of Canaan by the adversary. While Israel marched through the territory of the Amori, they encountered King Sihon, who was the king of the Amori at that stage, and he refused Israel the right of passage through his territory. Sihon mustered all his people and fought against Israel. However, Israel defeated the king and continued their journey to the plains of Moab. And what about the fear of Balak? Today, we took up the narrative in Numbers chapter 22, where Balak, the king of Moab, expressed grave concerns for his own personal welfare because of what Israel had done to Sihon, the king of the Amori. Now Moab and Ammon, their neighbors, were both direct descendants of Abraham's nephew, Lot. And for that reason, Yahweh had instructed Moshe that Israel were not to harm those people, either Moab or Ammon. Instead, Israel was to quietly camp on the plains of Moab and await instructions as to when and how they should cross the Jordan to take possession of their territory. Along with Moab and Ammon, there was also a third relative whom Israel had encountered on their journey. That was the nation of Edom, who were the direct descendants of Esau, the twin brother of Yaakov. All that background brings us back to Balak, the king of Moab, who, because of his ill-founded fear of Israel, sent messengers summoning Bil'Am, the son of Beor, as we read in chapter 22, verse 5. He sent messages to Bil'Am, the son of Beor at Petor, his native land, to tell him, "Listen, a people has come out of Egypt, spread all over the land, and is settling down next to me." So who is Bil'Am? Bil'Am was known in Scripture as an itinerant prophet or a seer who was renowned for his divining practices and his ability to curse people, put curses upon people. So Balak considers that he would be the ideal man to curse Israel. Bil'Am was a Midyan and was also a direct descendant of Abraham through Abraham's second wife, Keturah. So he knew Yahweh as El Shaddai, the God of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. Balak, by sending his princes to seek the support of Bil'Am, believed that he would curse Israel and bring about their ultimate demise. Putting a curse upon Israel was a very dangerous undertaking. However, Bil'Am, having been assured that he would be well paid for his services, was sorely tempted to take a risk, take a chance. He was going to make a lot of money. But was the payment worth the risk of incurring the wrath of Yahweh? We get a glimpse of his doubts in verse 8 when he said to the men from Balak, "Stay here tonight, and I will bring you back whatever answer Yahweh tells me." So the princes of Moab stayed with Bil'Am. Then in verses 12 and 13, Yahweh gives Bil'Am a very clear, unequivocal answer. You are not to go with them. You are not to curse the people, because they are blessed. Bil'Am got up in the morning, said to the princes of Balak, "Return to your own land, because Yahweh has refused to give me permission to go with you." That should have been the end of the matter. But Balak sends a second wave of princes of higher status than the first group. Knowing how strongly Yahweh felt about Balaam's earlier request, it would seem highly unlikely that he would approach Yahweh a second time. He therefore says to the second wave of princes, "Even if Balak were to give me his palaces filled with gold and silver, I cannot go beyond the word of Yahweh, my God, to do anything great or small." Now it's interesting that Bil'Am refers to Yahweh as my God, which clearly shows that he was aware of his ancestral origin through Abraham. Yet in spite of his knowledge of Yahweh, his desire for wealth gets the better of him, as he says, "Now please stay here tonight so that I may find out what else Yahweh will say to me." God came to Bil'Am during the night and said to him, "Get up, go with them, but do only what I tell you to do." Did Bil'Am really receive approval from Yahweh to go to Balak? Or maybe Yahweh was putting a test upon Bil'Am. Let's see what happened. We must not lose sight of the fact that what was going on here in this whole scenario is because of the battle that was going on between the adversary and Yahweh. It was being played out in the heavenly realm. Having instilled fear in the heart of Balak, the adversary was also working hard with Bil'am because of his lust for power and financial gain. We need to consider the whole scenario carefully. If we ask something of Yahweh and he gives us a clear no as an answer, would we go back and ask a second time? By asking a second time, maybe the answer is not from Yahweh himself. Particularly when we consider the words of verse 22. God's anger flared up. This is a very important thing to consider. Was it from Yahweh, or was it his own mind that was telling him it was time to go? Next we see the talking donkey. The encounter with the angel on the road occurred 3 times before Balaam's donkey spoke out and challenged Bil'am for having beaten him. Then the angel appears on the roadway, as we're told. Yahweh opened Balaam's eyes so that he could see the angel of Yahweh standing there with a drawn sword in his hand. And he, Bil'am, bowed his head and fell on his face. Lying face down on the roadway, Bil'am finally realizes the gravity of his own situation. He was a powerful seer, with powers doubtless given him by the adversary. But he was being confronted by the God of the universe. So what was his response? Had he been listening to Yahweh or Satan? He finally plucks up the courage to say, I have sinned. I didn't know you were standing there on the road to block me. Now, therefore, if I am doing what displeases you, I will go back. These are the words of a man who's faced the reality of the struggle that all humans face. If we listen to the words of Yahweh, the adversary will try even harder to convince us that his way is better. However, we can always have confidence that if we listen to Yahweh without allowing any space for doubt, he promises he will always stand by us and support us with all the things that we do, provided they are right and in accordance with his will. Yahweh can always turn a bad situation to his advantage if we allow him to guide us along the right path. As we see in verse 35, the angel of Yahweh said to Bil'am, No, go with the men, but then you are to say only what I tell you to say. So Bil'am went along with the princes of Balak. So Balak and Bil'am meet. When Bil'am arrives at the border of Moab, Balak goes out to meet him, greeting him with what's recorded in verse 37. Balak said to Bil'am, I sent more than once for you. Why didn't you come to me? Why did you think I wouldn't pay you enough? Then Balaam's response reflects his renewed trust in Yahweh when he says in verse 38, Here, I've come to you, but I have no power of my own to say anything. The word that God puts in my mouth is what I will say. So the terms of their contract was set. Bil'am made it clear to Balak that where he stood, and that he would not say anything except what Yahweh had given him to say. That, of course, was not what Balak wanted to hear. But being desperate to have Israel cursed, he continued on with their agreement. Neither party expected Bil'am would end up giving a blessing over Israel rather than the curse. But that is how Yahweh can turn a bad situation into a good one. 3 strikes and you're out. 3 times Bil'am consulted with God and was told what to say about Israel. Each time, rather than cursing Israel, he ended up blessing them, which greatly angered Balak. Hence, Bil'am received no payment for all his efforts. Having struggled against the adversary, on the 3rd attempt, Bil'am receives an outpouring of the Spirit of God, and begins pronouncing the words of praise upon the people of Israel. Now let's leap forward to chapter 24 and see. Bil'am begins an extended prophecy about the future of Israel. Firstly, he starts singing their praises by saying that he, Bil'am, was seeing what Shaddai sees, meaning that he was receiving the words directly from Yahweh. Finally, Bil'am concludes his discourse with the words about the king who stands up in Yehudah. Now, we know that the whole discourse was speaking about none other, of course, than Yeshua himself. We also see that his words are a direct reflection of what Yaakov had said in his blessing to the 12 sons back in Genesis chapter 49. When he speaks of Yehudah, which is referring, of course, to Yeshua, Yehudah is like a lion cub. My son, you stand over your prey. He crouches down, stretches like a lion, like a lioness who dares to provoke him. The scepter will not pass from Yehudah, nor the ruler's staff from between his legs, until he comes, to whom obedience belongs, until Shiloh comes. It is to him that the people will obey. Then Bil'am continues in verse 9 of Numbers chapter 24, speaking about Israel. Blessed are those who bless you. Cursed are those who curse you. Those are the same words that Yahweh said to Avram as he entered the land of Canaan, way back in Genesis chapter 12. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse anyone who curses you. And by you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. That was the promise that was given to Avram right in the beginning. So now we see the parting of the ways between Balak and Bil'am. In Numbers 24, 10 and 11, we find Balak raging at Bil'am, telling him to go home empty-handed. I summoned you to curse my enemies, but here you are, have done nothing but bless them. 3 times already. Now you had better escape to your own place. I have planned to reward you very well, but Yahweh has deprived you of your payment. Before Bil'am departs, he gives one last profound prophecy, which was directed against Balak and Moab. Let's look at the 4th pronouncement. Bil'am raises his eyes and saw Israel encamped on the edge of the Arabian desert. Then the Spirit of God descended upon him, and again he made the most profound and far-reaching statements in verses 14 through 16. Now that I am going back to my own people, I will warn you what this people, Israel, will do to your people, Moab and the others, in the Aharet Hayumim, that is the end of the end days. His pronouncement was totally different from the first 3 pronouncements. This 4th pronouncement was a prophecy about what would occur in the Aharet Hayumim. He is casting his words forward as a prophet to the age in which we are now living, in the 21st century. His words in verses 17 through 19 are profoundly important at this time, because it says, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not soon. A star will step forth from Yaakov. A scepter will rise from Israel, to crush the corners of Moab and destroy all the descendants of Shet. As I said in my book, The Scriptural Two-State Solution, all 3 parts of the kingdom of Jordan, which are Moab, Ammon, and Edom, are yet to be held accountable for their actions towards Israel. Now with those words, Bil'am concludes his prophecy. So what are the consequences? Edom, Moab, and Ammon are directly related to Israel through Avram. Yet, of all the nations around the land of Israel, They have caused Yahweh and Israel more grief than any other nation. The adversary has worked hard with these three nations, and that is why Bil'am's final discourse is focused solely on those three nations. The whole of Bil'am's fourth and final discourse centered around the ultimate destruction of these three nations that have throughout history been a constant thorn in the flesh of Israel. Now, I believe that the Ruach is showing me that rather than referring to all mankind, who are the descendants of Adam's third son, the words that Bil'am is speaking about when he talks about Shet, is speaking about the people of Shittim. So why Shittim? Because it's located across the Yarden River from Jericho in the kingdom of Jordan, just 40 kilometers from Amman. As we read in Psalm 137, remember, Yahweh, against the people of Edom, the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they cried, tear it down, raze it to the ground. That cry of Edom, or Esau, when Jerusalem was being destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, is the same mantra that is still being put forth by the Palestinians today. That brings me to another interesting feature. It was Bil'am who spoke out the words of Yahweh in condemning the three historic enemies of Israel, who will actually be destroyed with the return of Yeshua. It was not Moshe, nor any other person from Israel, who made that prophecy. Instead, it came from Bil'am, by a man who was one of their own. This may well explain why Yehuda decided to hand back control of the Temple Mount after the 67 war. By handing control back to Jordan and preventing the Jews from praying on the Temple Mount, it meant the Jordanians still remained in control of the Temple Mount, so they could never accuse Israel of taking control of the Mount. Only Yeshua will exercise the authority to take full control when he returns. The plain of Moab later became known as Perea, and it is the area in which Yochanan immersed Yeshua. It still remains an area that is in dispute between modern Israel and Jordan over the territory just across the river from Shittim, known as the Jordan Valley. It is still very much in dispute. We must also remember that the plains of Moab are part of the modern kingdom of Jordan, and particularly Shittim is right in the midst of the territory that God has claimed and will claim once again with the final blow upon these three nations. It will happen through none other than Yeshua himself when he returns. So in conclusion, the words of Bil'am's prophecy look forward to today in this world, in the Aharet Hayomim. And we must remember, as Bil'am was told to say, nothing good, nothing bad about the people of Israel. Shabbat Shalom.